Welcome back to the spring of 1954. A kid could buy anything on the Good Humor Man's wagon that spring for under 15 cents. Same price for black kids and white kids. Equal, you might say. But when the Good Humor Man parked in front of a school, all his customers might be one color or the other. 17 states required segregated schools. 4 states in the District of Columbia allowed them. Separate but equal, the law said. That spring, 9 old men in Washington would say the law was wrong.
Some barriers fall with a giant crash, as polio did. Others are whittled away, stone by stone, until the light from the other side begins to shine through. In the spring of '54, the sound of crumbling stone could be heard in Topeka, Kansas, and on television.
I'm your school bell, ding dong ding. Boys and girls all hear me ring.
Ding Dong School was one of our most popular children's shows. It was a classroom that, through television, welcomed all children at a time when real classrooms did not. In 1954, segregation was the order of the day.
I had playmates of all nationalities that I played with. But when school starts, we have to go to separate schools.
Linda Brown was a 3rd grader at the all-black Monroe School.
My mother would try very gently to explain it to me. She would put her arm around me and say, well, dear or sweetheart, it's because of the color of your skin that you cannot go to school with your playmates. And I would say, well, why?
Linda Brown's mother had to answer.
I was sad. I felt very sad that I had to tell her this, but somebody had to tell her, and it had to come from her parents.
Linda's mother and her father were not eager pioneers, but the white school was nearby, the black school far away, and when the NAACP decided to do something about it, the Browns volunteered. Topeka lawyer Charles Scott.
We would have to get some sort of a tangible evidence that a black parent escorted his or her child to the school to be admitted, and the principal at that school or one of the officials there would refuse enrollment.
I remember the school being very large, the steps being very tall, and we walked inside. My father spoke with the secretary and said he was there to enroll his child. She immediately went inside and got the principal.
Being a company man, I followed board policy.
Frank Wilson, principal of the all-white Sumner School.
I knew that I was going to say your attendance area is not Sumner, but is whatever Monroe, as I recall. And they knew that I was going to refuse their enrollment. And that was the opening scene of the play.
My husband, as I said, was very much upset, and he said that together with the NAACP, they were going to file a suit against the Board of Education here in Topeka.
We filed the school case on for the purpose of doing away with the separate but equal doctrine. It was a novel situation, and we didn't know exactly how the court would react.
The Browns lost the case in the Topeka Federal Court, which ruled that Topeka's segregated schools provided equal facilities for blacks and whites and were therefore legal under the old separate but equal doctrine. The NAACP brought the Brown case and 4 similar ones to the Supreme Court, which had established the separate but equal doctrine in 1896. The cases languished here for nearly a year and a half because the narrowly divided court wanted unanimity on an issue as sensitive as this. And finally, it got it. In an opinion written without dissent by the new Chief Justice, Earl Warren, the Supreme Court declared that segregated educational facilities are inherently unequal. On that day, the court delivered on the inside what it promises on the outside.
Amazing grace.
I was at home that day in May 1954 when I heard that the Supreme Court had handed down the decision to outlaw segregation in the schools. Oh, and I was so happy. Tears ran down my face as I did the ironing, and I could not hardly wait until the children got home from school so that I could tell them about it.
I do remember coming home that day in May, and my mother sharing with me what she had heard on the radio that day about the decision being handed down in favor of desegregation of schools. I remember my father coming home and seeing tears of joy in his eyes and him saying, "Thanks be to God."
I
It was a constitutional milestone and a moment long overdue in the land of the free. Come back to our world for the consequences of the Acts of Spring, 1954.
Well, rock and roll, Sports Illustrated, and color television sets, all born in the spring of 1954, certainly have thrived. Polio is virtually extinct. Senator Joe McCarthy is long since gone, and his deceit and cynicism with him. Although no successful politician today dare be colored red. And segregated schools, they're still here, even in Topeka.
The concept of having totally desegregated schools has not come about after 35 years.
Linda Brown is still fighting the Topeka School Board. Brown versus the board has been reopened to see if the school board actually did what the court told it to do, desegregate. There have been 4 weeks of testimony. There is no decision yet. De facto segregation remains an American issue.
Dr. Salk's inoculations of a dead polio virus paved the way for Dr. Albert Sabin's orally administered live virus. In 1954, 38,000 people contracted polio. Last year, there were less than 10. Now there's a new plague, AIDS. It's killing people at the rate of 25 a day, and no vaccine in sight. Yet.
As long as I continue to dig communists out of government.
6 months after the Army-McCarthy hearings ended, the Senate voted to censure Senator Joe McCarthy, ending his red baiting, his political career, and some of the trouble he made. Almost 20 years later, another set of televised hearings would rock the government. Once more, Attorney James St. Clair played a major role, this time defending President Richard Nixon in Watergate.
Rock lyrics have turned from "I can't get no satisfaction" to "I'm going to force you at gunpoint to eat me alive." End quote.
Concerned parents, congressional committees. The sexually explicit, violent lyrics of today's rock and roll have caught the attention of adults in a way the music never did. As for the youth of America, rock and roll is no longer their subculture, it's their culture.
The hydrogen bomb. They called it the cheapest form of destruction known to man, and they were right. The Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the U.S. agreed in 1963 to stop testing bombs above ground, but not underground. So far, in 1986, the U.S. has exploded 13 nuclear bombs underground, the most recent one on October 16th. The bomb seems here to stay.
Well, there it is, the way it was in the spring of 1954. We were intimidated enough by that big bomb to curb, if not eliminate, our appetite for nuclear weapons. We paid less attention that spring to a voice warning us about conventional war fought in an unconventional way. The French were under siege that spring at Dien Bien Phu, fighting and losing their war in Vietnam. A French journalist, quoted in Time magazine, said, "Everyone demands that we fight on out here. But there is something about Asian wars these days. They cannot be won in the old ways. You cannot win unpopular wars. We are up against something too big." End quote.
Sometimes unpopular wars are won only through the courts. That is what law is for. It would be pleasant to say that we weren't a nation that bullied its black people. It would be pleasant, but not true. In 1954, we were that bully. In the spring of 1954, what was true in Topeka, Kansas, was true throughout most of this country. In Chicago, it took close to 1,000 policemen to protect one black family, the Howard family. They had the audacity to qualify and move into a previously all-white project. Mrs. Howard was stoned as she left church. The stones were thrown by people who had also been in the church for services. One night, white teenagers skulked around the Howard apartment. A cop turned to one. "Why aren't you home watching Arthur Godfrey on TV?" The teenager spat on the sidewalk. "It's a free country, isn't it?" Yes, and no, and so it goes.